temptations. That's always the theme on the first Sunday in Lent. Always we read from one of the gospel accounts of Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, and always there are the three temptations. But we get a bonus this year, because every third year we also hear the story of Adam and Eve and their temptation to take a bite out of the forbidden fruit. Well, my temptation this morning is to bite off more than I can chew and talk about all these readings all at once. St. Paul is my tempter in this case. In that reading from Romans, he plants the seed connecting Adam in paradise with Jesus in the wilderness. Now, before I say anything more, I do want to say this about what Paul has to say about the garden. He doesn't hint that Eve is to blame. There are centuries of bad theology and awful sermons about that. And I'll say more about it in a bit, but it's enough for me now to notice that Paul says Adam was Jesus' polar opposite. Paul doesn't bring Eve into it at all. That said, I'm really not all that interested in the details in that reading from Paul's letter to the Romans. I'm not that interested in the back and forth between the one man, Adam, and the other one man, Jesus Christ, about the one man's trespass, the one man's disobedience versus the one man's obedience. I find it perhaps not terribly edifying to get too lost in all of that. But I will take Paul's example to heart all the same and suggest to you that there's something helpful in our considering these two ancient stories side by side and what they have to say to each other. For starters, both are mythic in scope. Adam and Eve, of course, are characters from a time before time. They were planted in the Garden of Eden, but we cannot hope to find that garden on a map. And Jesus is, well, Jesus. And even if we could locate his wilderness on a map, the GPS coordinates are not the point. And although food features prominently in both stories, the symbolic nuances are the point. Sometimes an apple is more than an apple, and bread more than something we need to make a sandwich. They're about hunger, what we want. What's going on in both stories, I think, is that Adam and Eve are told who they are as Jesus is told who he is, and they're all told why they were put here. The question confronting them both is whether that's enough. Let's start at the beginning with Genesis. Now, before the start of our passage this morning, Genesis says that God had formed Ha-Adam, I'm not probably pronouncing that correctly, Ha-Adam out of Ha-Adamah, which translates as the human out of the humus, the earth creature out of the earth. The first human being, neither male nor female at the start, was formed of the earth and filled with the breath of God, intimately joined to all creation, formed of the earth, and deriving its breath, its life, from the creator of all there is. But that first human, and this is where we pick up the story this morning, that first human toiled in the garden alone. And that was not good. That's God's estimation of the situation. That human needs a companion, and so all the living creatures were formed, and none of them were good enough. These are the verses we skipped this morning if you look at the citations in your bulletin. None of them were good enough, and so God causes a sleep to come over this human thing, this earth creature, and separates a rib, by one translation, perhaps a whole side. The words are a little unclear in their meaning. And it's only then that Adam becomes Adam and Eve becomes Eve. And Eve became Adam's partner. The King James Bible calls her his helpmeet, his equal in every respect. They were intimately begotten by God and made caretakers of this garden we call creation. And they stay together in everything that follows. Never a moment when Eve goes wandering off by herself to take the fall. Eden. We sometimes call it paradise. A place of abundance, full of life and filled with all that they needed to thrive. All they had to do was till and keep it. It was their sacred trust. That's not our reality, of course. We don't live in paradise. And yet, in a sense, that really is the truth for us too. Consider the world around us, especially in comparison to how so many others live all over the world. A case could be made that this really still is paradise, a land of abundance where there truly is food enough for everyone. And yet, like Adam and Eve, we're not content with all that we have. We want more. And more is what the serpent offers. It's not just that the fruit looked good and tasty, though it did look that way. They craved it because it promised to make one wise. The line used by the serpent to close the deal is this: and you will be like God. Adam and Eve, intimately begotten by God, children of God, and placed in the midst of God's glorious creation as sacred caretakers, weren't content with all of that. It wasn't enough to be made in the image and likeness of God. They wanted to be like God, God-like. Not content with their sacred birth and birthright, not content with this sacred creation and the sacred vocation that had been entrusted to them, they longed to carve out an identity independent of all that was already so holy. So Eve took the fruit, she ate of it, and don't miss the point, she gave some to her husband who was with her. He was with her the whole time. She wasn't off doing this by herself. He just kept his mouth shut. They stand in for all of us, both of them, both male and female. Adam and Eve ate the fruit together, and with the knowledge they gain, they see themselves as if for the first time, and they see how woefully inadequate they are on their own, so they cover up as best they can. And when God comes calling, which is the very next verse, past where we left off, when God comes calling, they hide. The serpent had reassured them both that it would be okay. They will not die, he said. And in one sense, the serpent was right. They didn't die, but something did die all the same. What they once enjoyed was a sort of holy trinity of God and creation and humankind, three in one and one in three, bound together, delighting in uncomplicated trust and mutual vulnerability, no shame. They were kindred souls, playmates, friends, man and woman and God. and that all dies. That's the power of this sacred story. We don't live in paradise. Paradise is lost. Hang on to that as we consider this morning's gospel. Before this morning's gospel begins, Jesus had been told who he was, and then the Spirit leads him off into the wilderness, dripping wet from his baptism, as Barbara Brown Taylor once put it. At baptism, he was told, or a voice announced, I should say, a voice announced, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Would that be enough for him? The time in the wilderness tests the proposition. Adam and Eve were planted in paradise with sacred work to do, to care for the world as God created it to be. Jesus was given sacred work as well, announcing God's desire to restore the glory of that original vision of Eden. God created the world to be a certain way, and Jesus wanted nothing more than to make it that way again. Beautiful, free, and full of plenty for all. Adam and Eve started out in paradise, Jesus in the wilderness. That's not our reality, of course. That's not where we live, and yet, in a sense, it really is. Life can be empty for us, at least during some of life's seasons, hollow, desolate. We hunger and thirst. If we've ever known such desperate times, perhaps we know how appealing that first temptation would seem. The temptation must have been a little like that place before Adam and Eve, the temptation not to be human, to be something more, which is to say the temptation to be like God, free of discomforts and hungers and sorrows. Jesus said no to the idea of making God obsolete in his life. He would allow God to be God and not try to put himself in that spot. And in that regard, the first temptation is not so very different from any of the other temptations put before Jesus that day. Jesus won't test God's love, dictating terms to God, demanding God serve his needs instead of the proper way around. Jesus came out of the waters of baptism not to impose his will on anyone else, but to announce the reign of God, a way of living in which none of God's children lord it over anyone, a dream of a world that is as beautiful and free as God imagined, full of plenty for all. And there is no shame for Jesus in the end, as there was for Adam and Eve. There is no shame, he insists, in being human. No shame in being hungry, no shame in being vulnerable, no shame in being counted among the common people of the world, working for God our Creator and keeping and tilling the ground where we are planted together with those who share this garden with us. The stories really are contrasting responses to the same question. Is it enough for any of us to rejoice in being human, to care for the creation entrusted to us, and to care for one another along the way? Or will we betray that trust, turning against God and one another, placing all of them in second place behind us? In the respective responses of the one man, Adam, along with Eve, and the other one man, Jesus Christ, these stories seem like polar opposites. And for the most part, they are. But there is one slender thread that runs through both those stories that is the same. We're told that after the devil left Jesus, the angels came and waited on him. It's a sign of God's tender love for Jesus. And that seems an appropriate kindness to show him, given all he'd just been through. There's nothing like that in our first reading this morning unless we read further, which is a thing we should do. For if we were to read further, then we would see that God notices the fig leaves Adam and Eve are wearing, and God makes for them garments of skins to replace them. It's a small kindness, and it's a curious detail to include, unless the point is to declare that God's tender mercies will always go before us, always blessing us in our humanity, even when we fail to embrace it. Deserved and undeserved, God will love us always. Beloved, we are God's people, made in the image and likeness of God, and we are called to love this earth and all who live with us in paradise. Will that be enough? What more could we ask?